Bring it forward because it has those.
Forget to bring a towel. There he is.
What up, everyone? So today I want to talk with you about how to repair a leaking toilet. And by leaking, I'm talking about when your toilet leaks through the base out onto the floor. This is a really common issue, and you can tell you have this problem if you notice water around the base of your toilet, if it starts to seem spongy or soft, or you feel water on your feet when you're using the toilet. And it happens because there are two bolts that secure the toilet to the floor, one on either side. If one of those comes loose, what happens is your toilet will begin to rock when people sit on it, back and forth and side to side, and that compresses the gasket underneath it and causes it to crack and dry out. And as that happens, the wastewater or sewer water, which is actually what it is, this is water, which nobody wants on their floor. That water, it comes out around that gasket and soaks into the floor. And over time, what'll happen is that water will rot your floor in your bathroom. This is a problem that you're better off to take care of sooner rather than later. And I think the majority of people would have no idea how to do this repair. This is something people would think they would need to call a plumber for. But the truth is that this is a really easy and inexpensive repair. You can do it yourself. I don't care if you're a man or a woman, you can do this because it just really isn't that difficult, and it's also not that expensive. The gasket you have to replace probably costs $5 or $10 and a new set of screws. Now there are ways that this could get complicated if the flange underneath it is broken. What it boils down to is even if you can't get it bolted back down, it's still good to put a new gasket underneath it because that will stop the water for a good long time. Another thing to consider is that the water that's coming out of your toilet, it is water that has touched the of every single person who's ever on your toilet, and it is also water. Anybody who's peed in your toilet, that is seeped out onto your floor if you have this problem. This leak is not to be confused with a leaking supply line, which is the pipe that runs from the floor to the tank in the back of your toilet, and that line can leak also. When it leaks, people tend to notice it right away because they tend to leak fast. This is a very slow leak that happens over long periods of time, but the number one diagnostic feature you can use to figure out if you have this problem is, does your toilet rock? Because if your toilet rocks when you're sitting on it, then you have this problem. So take heart, get off the sofa, and let's go fix that leaky toilet. The first thing you're going to need is a wax ring. Some people call it a donut. This is a seal that toilet rides on top of, and it keeps water from flowing over onto your floor. You can pick these up at any hardware store. Pair of gloves. Wrench, pair of pliers. I'm using because I have, but if you don't have the ratchet and the sockets for removing the bolt, you can just use this kind of wrench if you have one. And if you don't have this kind of wrench, you can just use a pair of pliers unless the nuts are too tight. You may need a screwdriver to remove the caps off of the bolts that hold the toilet to the floor. Okay, here is the offending toilet. It has multiple problems. It's flushing slow. That's one of the main reasons I wanted to take it up. But as you can see, it's loose. So that means the screws that secure it to the floor are not in the right place. The first thing you want to do when working with the toilet is make sure you have an area around it that's clear, whatever you keep around your toilet. You don't want a lot of stuff up close to it because the toilet's big and you need room to remove it from the space where it's sitting in and lift it off and set it aside so you can get to what's underneath it. In other words, you need a work area. So I've already done that. Let's remove the tank top. Alright, notice the tank is full of water. Take this top and set it aside somewhere where it's safe. And just a note, toilets, most of them are made out of what's called vitreous china. It's the same as plates or whatever. If you drop it in any way, it can crack really easily, and if it cracks, there's no fixing it. If you don't want to have to get a new toilet, then just be real careful. Just empty out the water tank. Here's my supply. These run from the bottom of the tank up here down to a valve which goes into a pipe. So in my case, I have this valve. It takes a quarter turn to turn it off. So in this case, when this long piece is at a right angle to the flow of water, it's turned off. Some of them have a screw valve, which is lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, for those of you who don't remember. If you have one of those and you want to turn it off, just turn it to the right until it stops. But don't over-tighten those because it's real easy to do. So now that my supply is cut off, I'm going to flush it and hold it down until as much water drains out as possible. I want it to be absolutely as empty as possible. You'll notice there's still a little bit of water left in the bottom of the bowl. The less water that you have in here, the less is going to get on the floor when you tilt the toilet over. Get as much out of the bowl as I can. That's all the water I can get out. Just that much less I'll have to clean up off the floor. So what I'm going to do is place a screwdriver underneath here, underneath the washer, and pry up gently. You have to be careful with these vitreous china toilets because they can crack. When they do crack, they're impossible to fix. So I'll pry up, put a little pressure, turn the nut, and you'll notice now the bolt has stopped spinning. When I get to the end, I'll continue, put a little pressure until the nut comes off. Set these aside so you don't lose them. Now I'm going to remove the second bolt. So in this case, I'm using my wrench. You just turn it, lefty-loosey. This one is not spinning on me, so I can remove it quite easily. So nut comes off. This is the washer that goes under the nut. Then underneath that is a plastic piece, and this piece kind of holds the toilet in place. It fits right down on here, and the metal washer always goes on top, and it keeps the nut from crushing the plastic piece. Both sides are removed. My toilet is loose from the floor. The final thing that I have to do before I try to remove the toilet is to undo the supply line to the tank. For this, I'm just going to use a real simple pair of pliers. I'm going to set them on their wide setting, which looks like this. Let's see if I can get this off. Again, this is lefty-loosey, righty-tighty. So to get this one off, I'm going to go to the left. Because my supply is turned off at the valve like you saw earlier, I should just be able to unscrew this, come right off. That's good, not too much leaked. The toilet is completely loose and it should lift right up. I know there's a little bit of water left in it, so I'm going to put down a towel. When this toilet comes up, there's going to be a wax ring. The old one is still going to be in the bottom. This stuff is generally made out of beeswax. It's very sticky. You do not want to get it on your clothes. You don't want to get it on anything. Now you have to be really gentle. And with this back part, if you pry on it real hard, you can break this toilet right along here, and it will happen. Be really careful. These toilets are heavy and they're awkward, so be careful with your back. Try to use leverage. So I'm going to lift up, bring it forward, because it has those well, there we go. So, my first video has turned into an utter disaster. In the midst of telling you guys to be really careful, I let it slip out of my hands and I smashed the tank. I could not have planned that if I would have wanted to. I was going to get a new toilet anyway. Remember how I told you that it's impossible to fix these? This video has just turned into a video about how to fix your broken toilet. So that's what we're going to do. Remember how I told you about the donut gasket? That is what you're looking at. Before you can put on the new gasket, you have to remove the old one. And it's really not that hard, but the only thing you want to be careful of is that you do not get that wax on your hands. Other than the fact that it's completely nasty, it also is extremely sticky. So I have a container to put it in. This is an old Tupperware container that doesn't matter, but it has a sharp edge for scraping off this wax. So you just scoop up what you can get, you scrape it in, and you just keep going till you got it all. See how it was out around the edge? That's how these things start to leak, is because first the bolts that hold the toilet down get loose. Either they work out from people sitting on it repeatedly, and once they get loose, actually in this case you can easily see what happened. The flange broke. So see right here, this piece, that flange is broken. Not only that, is pried up there, so from the toilet leaning forward it's pulled this flange up. So this flange is not removable because it is part of the pipe. There's nothing I can do to fix this at the moment because I'm going to have to cut it down in the basement and replace it. I'll have to get a new flange. I'm still getting as much of this wax out as I can. Notice I'm wearing my gloves now. The toilet, as you saw earlier, is broken. But I think that if I would have been wearing my gloves, that would not have happened, because when this vitreous china gets wet, it's kind of like when you're walking in the creek and you step on a rock that's covered with moss. It's sort of slippery. My hands are wet, there was water on the toilet, I was lifting at an awkward angle and it slipped out, and of course, as previously stated, it is fragile. And it slipped right out of my hands. A giant piece broke off of the tank. That's most of it. The next thing you want to do is scrape off as much of the residue from the original gasket off the bottom of the toilet as you can. This is your seal, wax ring with flange. The flange is just basically this black part right here that points down inside the pipe. This came from Ace Hardware. These don't cost much, they're a few bucks. So here it is. And it needs to stay in this shape. And that's it. There's your new gasket. Now is where I have a problem because I have a broken flange. I can't replace it right now because I don't have one. And it would be a much bigger job. So what I'm going to do is these need to be about right here. And see, originally this one would go in through this slot right here and slide back, but there's no place for it to land because that side is blown out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of the old wax and I'm going to do this. So I'm just trying to build this up around this screw so that when I set the toilet down, hopefully that screw will not move, because we do not want that. Because when you set this toilet down, if those screws move, then you have to pick it up again and redo it. And it's not really fun. It's real easy to miss the holes in the bottom of the toilet when you're lifting it up and setting it back down. And if you do that, you can compress that gasket, and you should only do that once when you first set it down. And if you have to do it twice, it gets kind of complicated. We want to avoid that if we can. And after I get this done, I'm going to show you. I know I said that toilets are impossible to fix, but that's not quite true. They can be fixed. They're never quite right again, but they can be fixed. So I'm doing my best to line these up the way that I know the holes are in the toilet. That looks pretty straight to me. Let's see if I can make it fit on there. So here comes the hard part. So I've got to get this toilet on those two screws. And I can't miss. Alright, now, again, although I've proven myself to be the person who should be taking the advice, not the one who's giving it, you want to be careful lifting up on this thing because it will break. Now I'm trying to set this on these screws. Made it. Okay, I got it on the screws the first try. So if you look down at the bottom here, you see there's a gap there. And as I'm rocking it, that gap is getting smaller and smaller as the toilet sinks down onto that wax seal as it compresses. And once you just rock it slightly, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, and as you do, it'll slowly sink to the floor. And that's about as low as it's going to get. So what I discovered when I had the toilet apart was that my flange was broken. And the flange is what holds these bolts. Actually, it holds your whole toilet secure to the floor. It was broken on this side. So I'm putting this bolt back in and this nut. And it really is just for the appearance's sake because it's not actually holding anything. But I'm still going to put it in, give it a little tighten. Not too much because it might have a little bit of a grip. Not much. So put the cap back on. The other side, however, is nice and tight. It does have a place to attach on that flange. I do have a good bolt on this side, so I'm going to have at least one side of the toilet secured. Now, for the purposes of this video, you didn't have a broken flange, and you were able to put in both sides. Then once you get these bolts and nuts secured, your toilet should be firmly attached to the floor. which is what you want, because this is how, having a loose toilet, having those bolts loose, is how that gasket gets worn out and broken, because anytime the toilet moves, that gasket flexes and it dries out over time, and eventually it breaks, and then water starts to spill out across the gasket when you flush, and that's how you get a rotten floor. I have the new gasket in, and even though this side is not attached, that gasket will last for a good long time. And even though my toilet does rock a little bit, it's still going to be usable, because that gasket is going to keep it from having leaks. And I do have a bolt on the other side which will keep the toilet secure. If I had no bolts, then that would be bad, but I have one. So the toilet is secured to the floor, the new gasket is in. Now on to the big problem. As you saw in my earlier video, voila, the broken toilet. So I guess my subconscious wanted me to make a video about how to fix a broken toilet. And I know I said that it's impossible to fix a broken toilet, and that is true. You cannot fix this damage. But what you can do is you can glue it. Problem with this china is that it's made in one piece, and there is absolutely no way to get rid of a crack or to join these two pieces back together in a way that is seamless. What you can do, however, is you can glue it. So that's what I'm going to do. And the glue that I'm going to use, and what I'm doing right now is I'm just cleaning these surfaces where I want them to join. There can't be any water or dirt. The one thing about china when it breaks is the pieces tend to be fairly well defined. So that should go back together pretty well. It's never going to be right. There's always going to be a crack. That's okay, because I knew that I was going to have to replace this toilet anyway. The glue that I'm going to use is 2-part epoxy adhesive, which you can buy at just about any store. Walmart has it. Ace Hardware has it. There it is, the toilet repair. Alright, so I really wanted to show you how I did the epoxy repair on this toilet tank. And this is kind of hard to see, but you can see the crack there where it was. So I had just enough epoxy to repair this crack in this toilet tank. And the memory card on this thing filled up. The video cut off and I didn't realize it, and I'd already mixed up this epoxy. And the thing about epoxy is once you start mixing it, you can't stop for anything, because once that chemical reaction starts taking place, it's going to harden and there's nothing you can do to stop it, so you have to keep on going. So that's exactly what I did. I mixed it up. This is what it looks like. So you see this? I mixed it on this plastic piece because if you mix it on paper, what happens is any kind of cardboard or paper, the cardboard or paper tends to absorb the epoxy, and you wind up losing like a quarter or a third of your epoxy to soakage into that porous surface. So this stuff is pretty hard now. It's no longer sticky. It feels like plastic. And what I did is I came across with the putty knife and I put a little bit on every single bit of this surface on that edge and over here where the handle goes through. And then I put the piece in place while the epoxy was still soft. And you have to put pressure on something like this in order to get it to set tight. And that's exactly what I did. I sat here for about 5 minutes and I pushed in this direction and I pushed down and I held it there. And I could tell by tapping my finger right here on the leftover epoxy how hard it was, how tacky it still was. And I held it here until I could tell that epoxy had hardened to a point that it was probably more than halfway cured. If I would have let it go before then, it could have come off, it could have lifted up a little bit, and I didn't want any of that to happen, so I just held it until I was sure that it wasn't going to move. This is going to be waterproof, I'm pretty sure, because if you look in here, so here's the water line right there, you can see it all the way around. I have it pretty low because the water level is adjustable through your valve, but I have it pretty low so I can keep down the water consumption. And the crack, you can see the crack runs just about 3/4 of an inch under the water line. And when I pushed down this broken piece that runs all along this corner, it squeezed out a bead of epoxy all along the line of that crack. And rather than cut off that bead, I'm just going to leave it there because it's going to act as a waterproofing seal. I also have this RTV, this Permatex RTV silicone. And what I was thinking about doing was putting a bead of that silicone along that crack on the inside because I wasn't sure if I had enough epoxy, but because of the way it wound up gluing up, I think that it's going to be watertight. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and put it back together and fill up the tank and see how it works. And if it leaks, I'll go back in and put in the silicone, but if it doesn't, especially since the water line is so low, I think it should be fine. And if it does leak, then as they say, Bob's your uncle. So another thing you should know is you can see there's a lot of excess, and I actually took a knife and I spread it on here because there's some places where this crack is pretty wide. If I were going to try to leave this here long term, what I would do is I would come behind with a razor knife and I would scrape all this off, and it would come off pretty easily because this stuff on this slick surface of this china, it will come off pretty easily with a razor blade. But since this toilet is going to get thrown away anyway, or it's going to get replaced, and because I want to maintain as much of the water tightness as I can, I am going to leave it just like it is. It's not that pretty, but I think it'll work. But if I were to scrape it off, I think it would make that crack so that it's a lot less visible. But even if I scrape that off, that dark line is always going to be there, because anytime you make a repair like this, it is just impossible to make that line of demarcation where that crack happened go away. So now the next thing I have to do is put the toilet back together, which in this case means putting the supply line back on. So it just screws on to the plastic piece, righty-tighty. Kitty. Meow, 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 meow. Kitty. Violet. What up, girl? Kiki. It's cold out there. You coming inside? Meow. Meow. That's Violet. She's one of the monsters I live with. I've hand tightened the supply line. Now I'm going to use my trusty wrench to tighten it the rest of the way. The thing about tightening anything like this is that the biggest mistake that people make is over tightening, because this thing has rubber gaskets inside of it, and a lot of people feel like when they're tightening something they have to gorilla tighten it, and when you gorilla tighten things you wind up making more problems than you solve, because this is not sealed by the tightness of the threads, it's sealed by the gasket inside of it. So keep that in mind when you tighten this line here or this one here, because over tightening can cause leaks and you don't want that. Got my supply line back on. Now I've got to figure out how to put the flush handle back in place. So the feed line is on, and let's turn it on and see if it fills up okay and see if it leaks. Alright, so it is not leaking. There is no water coming out. And this is one of the really cool things about epoxy. I only made this repair 20 minutes ago, and I've already got water in it, and it's withstanding it. So let's flush it one time. Make sure it fills back up. She works. First video, all I did was destroy one toilet. But it's back in working order. Click like and subscribe. Going to be a lot more videos, and they're not all going to be about toilets. Peace, monsters.